Hello, Christ the King Anglican Church. We would like to present a two-part series titled Sin and Grace. The topics we'll be covering after a brief introduction would be Part 1, Sin, which is what we will cover in this session. These include original and actual sin, what are commonly referred to as besetting sins, mortal and venial sins, and then the 7 deadly sins. In Part 2, which will be next week, we will cover the topic of grace, habitual and actual grace, sacramental, prevenient, and concomitant grace, and then a section on developing virtues and growing in grace. So, part 1, sin, and part 2, grace. Now, although we will be discussing these in different sessions, they really cannot be separated experientially, that is, in human experience. We can separate them academically, and we will do that to help understand them a little bit better. But if I were to ask you the question, when did sin begin? You would probably say Genesis chapter 3. This is when our first parents, in direct disobedience to God's instructions to not eat of the tree of good and evil, ate from the tree. And this is commonly referred to as the fall. If I asked you, when did grace begin? The answer would be the same, Genesis chapter 3. You'll recall that in verse 21, in response to man's sin, God from animals fashioned clothes with which to cover the nakedness of Adam and Eve. And also in verse 15, we have a prophecy that an offspring of the woman would bruise the heel of the serpent. And this is often referred to as the first pronouncement of the gospel. So even at the moment of our fall, grace was present. And this is not just a 1-to-1 ratio, one part sin to one part grace. Grace always predominates. In Romans 5:20, we have where sin abounded, grace did much more abound. So our general approach is going to be, although we can discuss these things in an academic sense, the emphasis is really going to be on personal reflection and application. Um, my belief is that we don't really need much more mere theological information about sin and grace, but we really do need assistance and better intention on how to avoid sin and how to increase grace in our lives. So, sin, this is different descriptions or definitions. Sin is disobedience to the will of God. It is a human act contrary to right reason, truth, and good conscience. Another aspect of sin is the misuse of our free will. And vices are sometimes used interchangeably with sins, but a vice really is a habit of sin. A sin which we do over and over is deemed a vice. So we'll first talk about original sin. This is a common but a confusing term because, strictly speaking, original sin is not a sin, but it is actually a sinful condition. It is hereditary. From the most well-known, the penitential Psalm, Psalm 51, verse 1, "Behold, I was shapen in iniquity, and did sin did my mother conceive me." The Revised Standard Version translates that I was brought forth in iniquity. So we should be clear that human reproduction in birth is not itself sinful, but sin is a part of our condition from the very moment of our existence. And it particularly involves a weakening of our will. We are all born with a tendency to sin due to this weakness of our will. And Adam introduced this into the human race. Now, we should be clear, though, that Christ, as the second Adam, reverses the effects of original sin and frees us from this. We have Romans 5:15, but the free gift is not like the trespass. For if many died through one man's trespass, that is Adam's, much more has the grace of God in the free gift, in the grace of that one man, Jesus Christ, abounded for many. So Christ is the second Adam. And we move from original sin to actual sins. And you can see they're referred to as actual because of the word act occurs right there in the name of these kinds of sins. And these are the sins that we commit. And in the general confession for during Holy Communion, we confess our manifold sins by thought, word, and deed against thy divine majesty. But deeds needs to be seen both as not just what we do, but as what we don't do. And this is underscored in the general confession for both a morning and evening prayer. We ask God's for forgiveness for what we have left undone that we should have done, and what we have done that we should not have done. So we actually have four categories of sins. We have sins of thought, word, and deeds committed. And fourthly, deeds omitted. Now, sins of word and of deeds committed, these are easy for us to see, easy for other people to see. Sins of thought and sins of deeds omitted or of omission, these are internal and unseen and they're harder to see. So we're going to spend some more time on those two. So sins of thought, we should first make a distinction that not all bad thoughts are sinful. Through our five senses, there are suggestions and attractions that enter our mind very quickly. And this is an involuntary process. Things that we are exposed to hit our minds. And at this point, our will is not engaged. They can come and go very quickly. However, these, what might be bad thoughts, become sinful thoughts when the mind deliberately responds to these suggestions and attractions and begins to think on them. This is the voluntary component. We're now exercising our free will in furthering these thoughts. So we give consent, we unnecessarily prolong them. So what was considered a bad thought, a fleeting thought just a few minutes before, has now become a sinful thought because our will is attached to it. What is the remedy for these? It's exercise greater discipline of our thoughts. We should avoid daydreaming. We should resist the distractions that we're constantly opposed to. This will help build up the capability to stop bad thoughts from becoming sinful thoughts. There are also sins of omission. It's another internal sin. These can be difficult to spot because they don't arise initially from a temptation to do something. It's something that presents to us that we should do, but we do not. And that in itself can be a sin of omission. And these are much more common than we think. It's not just times of laziness and lukewarmness or lack of activity when we should be engaged in something. So what is the remedy? Well, one way of thinking about this is to reflect on the first and great commandment, which is to love God with all our heart and soul and mind, and our neighbor as ourselves. So if we really were fulfilling the first and great commandment more, what would we start doing that currently we're not doing? And that can give us some insight into what might be our most frequent sins of omission. Besetting sins is another kind of sin. I put besetting in quotation marks, as you will see. This comes from Hebrews 12:13. Let us lay aside the sin which doth so easily beset us. However, sins don't happen to us. Sins are what we do. So to beset is to attack or assail something, and this really doesn't happen. We are the actors. So sins don't beset us. We are the besetters. By the way, besetters is not a real word, but I just like the balance of that. It's easier to remember it that way. But what does beset us is the temptation, because they arise before our will has really been engaged. But temptations are not sins. Some of the greatest saints have been tempted throughout their whole lives, but they were able to resist those, and we can too. 1 Corinthians 10:13. The temptations are such as is common to man, but God is faithful, and He will provide a way of escape so that we can withstand these. So, one of the remedies for recurrent temptations are the phrase watch and pray, which recurs throughout the New Testament. The watch part of this is a mental alertness to the presence of temptations, and we should know what our weak spots are and guard against them. Now, we should also recognize that temptations can be um, come our way with God's permission. He may allow us to be tempted in order for us to realize where our weaknesses are, in order to induce in us greater humility, drive us to prayer. These are always good things. Mortal and venial are very common classifications of sins. It comes from 1 John chapter 5, verses 16 and 17. If any man see his brother sin a sin which is not unto death, and here the Revised Standard Version actually translate that as a mortal sin. So this is what this verse is referring to. There are generally three criteria for something to qualify as a mortal sin. It must be a transgression of the known will of God. It must be done with full consent and knowledge, and it must be a weighty matter. There's another classification called venial sins. These are sins of infirmity or surprise. Um, Type A personalities are very driven. They may be more prone to the sin of anger, for example. Venial sins, compared to mortal sins, are a relatively unimportant matter. And they also include sins of ignorance, things which we do which are really contrary to God's will, but we don't know those at the time. Now, these classifications may be useful for you. And if so, you can continue to use these uh, as you confess your sins, as you seek confession and spiritual direction. But for others, these may not be helpful. As Anglicans, we are not obligated to accept this classification if it is not helpful to us. But what might be an alternative approach? Well, we can take the approach that all sin should be dealt with without needing to worry ourselves needlessly about the distinction between the categories of mortal sin and venial sins. We can recognize the cumulative effects of sins, even the ones that we might regard as minor. An analogy would be a little bit of dust on a mirror would barely obscure the image. But if that small amount of dust over time is allowed to build up, and all the small particles of dust build up over time, eventually it will start to distort the image. And we are to be the image of God. And we should want to make sure that even what might be regarded as smaller sins are dealt with. The other thing that we can think about is that unrepented sins can lead to more and more serious sins, and victory over small, quote unquote, small sins can lead to victory over big ones. God gives us the grace to gain a victory over small sins. This can bring down some other sins that we might not have been aware of, or we may not have been willing to tackle yet. But we should also recognize that repentance will not always look the same. We should make a distinction between the impact of, say, stealing our neighbor's car, which he may need or she may need for work. And stealing that vehicle is going to impact the ability of that parent to provide for their own family versus stealing some copy paper from the office for our personal use. Now, both of those are violations of the eighth commandment, thou shalt not steal. But the implications of those is very different, and repentance may look the same. And this is an alternative way of thinking about what we may regard as greater sins and lesser sins without needing to use the categories of venial and mortal. This is a table that attempts to set the 7 deadly sins, which are in that middle column, with what is often regarded as concupiscence, a word which we don't need to worry about, but I do want to reference 1 John 2:16, as well as the antidotes for these seven deadly sins. Now, first, let me say that the phrase 7 deadly sins is very common, but similar to besetting sin, it can lead to some confusion. Um, how serious does a sin need to be before it becomes deadly? How much pride does a person need to have unrepented of before it's be considered deadly or serious? So, what we can use instead of the phrase deadly sins would be capital sins. So we can think of these as the 7 capital sins. This is actually a phrase that's suggested by Anglican theologian Martin Thornton, who regards these 7 capital sins, capital meaning fundamental or major and leads to all other kinds of sins, as the basis for self-examination in confession. So when you're taking stock of yourself, this can be a useful way of thinking about that. So we have 1 John 2:16. I'll begin at verse 15. Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. So these aspects that are in the world, the lust of the flesh, which is disordered sense pleasures. And by the way, I'll use the word disorder or inordinate. When that is used, it basically refers to anything that is used without reference for God, apart from God's will, not in subordination to higher goods. The lust of the flesh, from this comes the sins of sloth, lust, and gluttony. The lust of the eyes is a disordered desire for worldly goods. And out of this comes the sin of avarice, sometimes called covetousness, and the one that is called the pride of life. Pride of life has to do with an independent self-satisfaction and self-inflation. And out of these comes the actual sin of pride, envy, and anger. So we'll take sloth first. Laziness is often used interchangeably with sloth, but I think that is too narrow. The sin of sloth has to do with avoidance of any kind of discipline or effort. It involves not just physical sloth, but mental sloth as well. The antidote, not surprisingly, is work. St. Benedict in his rule said that idleness is the enemy of the soul. So we should make provision for planned recreation and relaxation, observing the Sabbath, of course, but we should avoid mere idleness, things that are merely a time wasting, what C.S. Lewis refers to just as a sort of a dull flickering of the mind. We're just doing some things that really are not very productive. They're not tied to higher goods. This can be evidence of the sin of sloth. The second one is lust. This is indulging in unlawful sexual pleasures. We have Matthew 5:28. in which our Lord is discussing the sin of adultery. Uh, I say unto you that whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already in his heart. The English Standard Version translates it with lustful intent. I think that really gets at the meaning here. So there's two parts to lust. There's the looking, which is the physical part of it, and then there is the intent, looking with lustful intent, and this is the mental part, and both are present. What is the antidote? Well, it's charity. Increased love for others means that you're not going to take something from them, which is not yours. We need to maintain careful custody of our eyes. It also, a charity would involve, as an antidote, increased love for God. Blessed are those who are pure in heart, for they shall see God. Gluttony is the third sin which comes out of the lust of the flesh. This is an inordinate desire for the pleasures of taste. This is often narrowly restricted to just food and drink, and it's difficult to see sometimes we've committed the sin of gluttony because we need food and drink for our physical survival. But it's not just the actual act of that, it's thinking about them, giving an inordinate amount of time to food and drink that is beyond what is needed just for our sustenance. So as we're thinking too much about food and drink, we may not be thinking about other things that we should at that time. And gluttony often is seen just as quantity, overeating or over drinking. But I think that we can expand that to our soul's profit when we think of it also as a gluttony of delicacy, which is a term that you will remember from the screw tape letters. In other words, it's not just tempting someone to a quantity of food or drink, but the quality of it. We can commit gluttony when we are determined to have our own way, when it comes to something related to food and drink, wanting to have it just so. That's not gluttony of quantity, but it could be gluttony of quality. The antidote for these, fasting, which has to do with the quantity of food, and abstinence, which has to do with the quality of food. And also the virtue of temperance, which we will cover in next week's session. The fourth sin is avarice or covetousness. This is an excessive love of worldly goods, but that too can be expanded. It would be the desire for any good, even spiritual ones, for their own sake, as an end in themselves, without reference to God's will and how we should use them. So the antidotes would be generosity and stewardship. We hear every Sunday, all things come of thee, O Lord, and of thine own have we given thee. So we should not be seeking anything that we cannot say, I have been given this from God. We should enjoy things, but as he intended them to be enjoyed. As stewards, we hold everything in trust for God, and we are to use everything to his glory and for the good of others. The fifth one is pride. In a lot of lists, you'll see this put first because, in a way, all the other sins stem from pride. It is putting ourselves in the place of God. It is a primary rebellion of the soul, and it is an exaggerated view of one's own importance or our accomplishments or our abilities. The antidote to pride, not surprisingly, is humility, which involves not going around beating up on ourselves, wishing that we were less of what we already are, but it has to do with just seeing ourselves the way that God sees us. And if we do that, that will take us further down the road of humility rather than coming up with some artificial construction about how I should be seeing myself. We should be desiring only what God wills for us. Envy is a discontent with someone else's goods or health or happiness. It is a desire to see oneself as superior to others. And so you can see that this stems from pride. We can see pride as a sin against God, envy as a sin against others, although in the broader sense, all sins are sins against God. Oftentimes, when we're committing the sin of envy, we're finding something wrong. We're seeing some injustice that this other person shouldn't have or be seen in a certain way that really belongs to us. The antidote for envy is a real belief in the divine providence. And when you see the word providence, you see the word provide in there. So providence has to do with the belief that God will provide for everything that we need. And he who spared not his own son, won't he give us all that we really need? And also another way of combating envy would be a charity. I didn't include that on the slide, but if we truly desire the good of others as much as we do for ourselves, this would not leave very much room in our heart for envy. Anger is the last of the seven so-called deadly sins or capital sins. This occurs when someone or something thwarts us in some way. It often begins very small with impatience, and then we sort of give our wills over to this impatience, and it becomes anger. And as we indulge this feeling, we can stew for an hour because our coffee wasn't served soon enough for our liking. So um, the sin of anger must never be encouraged or prolonged. This is the reason Ephesians 5:26, Paul instructed us to be angry and sin not. Let not the sun go down upon your wrath. The antidote, or one antidote, and by the way, I don't intend these to be exhaustive antidotes, would be daily prayer and recollection. Impatience and anger are very difficult to counter in the moment. They happen so quickly. So we can take the approach of prevention is the best medicine. So we should always begin our day with prayer, getting our heart right before God, asking for his help throughout the day. There's also a recollection. A recollection are these very short prayers that are offered throughout the day when we're transitioning from one activity to another, going from one Zoom meeting to another, in between phone calls. We're going out to the mailbox to get our mail. These are small transitions that we could use for a prayer, just short prayers offered to God to help us for his help throughout the day. Also, it's practicing the presence of God. It's seeing everything that we do as an offering to him and asking his blessing for it. So how do we summarize this short catechesis on sin? There's a quote from C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity that I think will help put everything in its right context. We cannot trust ourselves, even our best moments. And on the other hand, we need not despair even in our worst, for our failures are forgiven. The only fatal thing is to sit down content with anything less than perfection. So for personal reflection and prayer, the following questions might be useful to you. Do I think differently about sin now than I did before? What kinds of sins do I commit most often? Are they by thought, word, or deed, or omission? And what is my plan to reduce my sins? So I look forward to discussing this with you in our meeting this week. God bless you.